Welcome everyone to our monthly Patreon Q&A. Thank you for your flexibility about moving the time. You're helping science. Madeline needed to move the time because she's doing some important lab work for her PhD. So it's very much appreciated. She does so much for me. I want to be very flexible and accommodating for her. So we're going to take the questions. We'll do some questions first that have already been submitted, and if there's time, we'll take some questions from the chat. So our first question is from Gabriel Garcia. Thank you so much for your support, Gabriel. Here's the question. Hello, thank you very much for your work. You're welcome. It's always, I know I say this, and I'm going to keep saying this, and it's always going to be sincere. I appreciate the encouragement. I appreciate the support. It helps a lot in ways that people might not realize. And so I just want to just say thank you for all of the support and even the expression of gratitude. It's helpful. So thank you very much, Gabriel. I'll continue. You already talked about it briefly in After Socrates, but can you share a little bit more about your morning routines? Do you have a fixed time to wake up? Do you practice before or after breakfast? Which practices do you do, and are they the same every day? Or do you vary them? How much time of practices every morning? Then I'll respond to the questions, but there's a final comment. Every person has a different situation, so I do not mean to try to copy someone's routine in every detail, but I think it could be useful as a reference point since I'm also testing out some morning routines. Yes, Gabriel, I'll answer that. So I have two routines. I do. One is my normal routine, and then I have a shorter version that only takes about 45 minutes. If I suddenly get slammed with a bunch of stuff I have to do and start my day very early, or etc. So I don't get up at the same time because sometimes when I'm at my partner's place, I get up earlier with her. When I'm at my place with my son, I get up later so he can have the space to himself to get ready for work. So there's some variation according to other people's schedules. I typically get up. I have breakfast, a light breakfast, and then take care of some initial things. Then I set aside time, usually an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half for the longer routine, and like I say, about 45 minutes, sometimes 40 minutes for the shorter routine. I want to emphasize that I can do sort of more compressed versions of the practice because each practice has been practiced for years, and therefore I can do I can do less of this practice because I can get into it more deeply. So I wouldn't take the time I do and the time I devote to be totally exemplary. Everybody should be varying how many practices they're doing and how much time they're putting into the practice according to where they are developmentally. So as long as everybody takes that in hand, I'll then answer your question. So I typically get up and I do some basic stretching exercises, loosening up exercises. Then I do Fijin, which is a fast striking version of Tai Chi Chuan. Then I do a sword form of Tai Chi Chuan. Then I do a mixture of Jianzheng. Jianzheng is when you're standing and holding a posture, like I'm standing and my knees are bent and I'm holding this posture. And what you're trying to do is relax as much as you can and build up a sense of internal oneness that's holding you up rather than sort of external strength. And then there's each one. Each one are some slow moving practices that overlap a little bit with Tai Chi Chuan. And then I do some of the exercises you've seen in After Socrates. I do opening and closing. I do the reciprocal opening exercise. I do what's called a Qigong called Bringing Down the Heavens. Then I'll do some Tai Chi Chuan, the slow form. Usually I do half of the form one day and the other half the other day. So there's a bit of novelty to the form. Then I end with some standing postures again. and then a closing thing called Bringing Down the Heavens. Then I sit down and I do the Socratic humbling wonder practices to open me up, um, and I do some final seated qigong practices. They're hard to describe because they're done mostly internally, the body. I do a bit of Reiki, and then I go into a deep meditative practice. And then I take that into the Neoplatonic contemplative practice that many are familiar with. Um, and then I come out of that doing the coming out exercise, integrating what I cultivated in my practice with my everyday consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas. Then I do Lectio Divina. I typically read from Plotinus right now, and then somebody else like Dionysius, Nicholas of Cusa, Maximus. And so I do the Lectio within and then the Lectio between. And then I do a practice, responsive poiesis. I haven't talked too much about that right now because I'm still practicing a lot. Basically, I have a book of Sufi poetry because for me, the Sufi poets are the best for capturing the liturgical and Lectio Divina and poetic aspects of Neoplatonism. And so I'll read that text in a very Lectio fashion, and then I will try to pick up the poiesis, and write a poem in response, but not just in response, but more in dialogue. What, or better, in dialogos, what has been evoked and provoked and invoked in me. The author's being invoked, and that's provoking and I write a poem in response, not for anybody else, just in response. And then I'll do the internal dialogue practice. And then I end by reading a quote. It varies every day from Socrates. And then I end with the famous Socratic prayer. It goes something like, O Pan and all gods who haunt this place, please give me the beauty within, and let the inner man and the outer man be in harmony. It's something to that effect. I read that, and then I commit to the 4 promises that I'm going to try and live throughout the day. The 5 precepts, and then I begin my day. And of course, I try when I can to meet with people and do philosophical fellowship and do dialectic and do dialogos. I also consider a proper part of my practice to teach philosophical fellowship, to teach dialectic and to dialogos, to teach in the workshops, etc. I'm trying to make it a part of my practice to read philosophy, especially what I would call philosophia, philosophy for the cultivation of wisdom, independent from all the philosophical texts I read for my work. But that's proving to be a little bit challenging because they bleed into each other so much. But those are the practices I try to do every day. I do a remembrance practice. I carry around a tiger eye stone, or sometimes a pure black stone, which for me represents Zen as sort of the great integration of Taoism and Buddhism. And I carry around a frog, which is Neoplatonism. And then I try to commit myself to these practices and these frameworks throughout the day. So thank you, Gabriel, very much for your question. I hope that wasn't pedantic or a burden in any way. And again, please, everybody, remember what I said. Don't leap into that. That's because I've been doing all of these practices a lot, and then working with others and teaching them, and then so I can do them in a much more, I don't want to, compressed isn't quite the right word, sort of get to the through line a lot faster. And you will too with time. You will too, definitely with time. So thank you very much. We'll now move on to a question from Martin. And I want to thank Martin very much for his support. What changed for you after going through the dialectic into dialogos practice with some of your most trusted friends to be later shared with the entire world? And what would you recommend we take away from this perception change you had? I'll answer the question, but there's a comment. Also, I'm finding it a bit difficult to think that the dialogos spark can be kindled at all with people outside one's most trustworthy group or groups that we know about the practice, that know about the practice and follow it. And I'm wondering if you recommend anything we should try to do, like a specific posture, mental or physical, to help dialogos to ignite in most situations. Yes. So let's answer the question and then give the requested recommendation. To be shared with the entire world, it's an odd thing. Some of it's idiosyncratic and has to do with my temperamental deficiencies and defects, which has to do with an enhancement of that sense of sort of raw exposure, and a sense of exposing my friends. I mean, that sounds a little bit domineering. They're not my possessions or anything like that, but I hope it's a sense of concern for them. Also, gratitude that they were willing to follow me on this journey. A sense of how it needs to, and I think you're foreshadowing this, Martin, a sense of how it needs to be really properly formatted. Dialectic and dialogos should not be practiced independently of a shared ecology of practices, nor should it be practiced unless one has gone through the pedagogical program that we demonstrated in episodes 10A and B, and that we do the weekend workshops on. And so it also, when we did the dialectic into, this will come later, sorry, this will be episode 24. Chris and Guy and Taylor come back and we do dialectic into dialogos about the virtue of dialectic itself. And that sort of Hegelian moment deepened my perception and appreciation of dialogos in a very, 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 very powerful way. So I'm growing through this thing where there's a growth arc. I'm seeing it through other people's eyes. I'm seeing it also on behalf of my friends who partook of it with me and went public with it. I'm appreciating a lot of the feedback comments we're getting. I do, now to move on to the recommendation, I do not think you can just do this with people unless they have done the pedagogical program that's shown in 10A and 10B, and they are doing some ecology of practices that at least overlaps with yours. They have some mindfulness practice, they have some movement practice, etc. And I think really doing the Vipassana meditation and the Neoplatonic contemplation, and then just the base, perhaps like the basic noticing and paraphrasing practices, is really, really important before you, to get you in sort of the right stance to enter into dialectic, into dialogos. Now, like everything else, and I said this in the last question, the more you practice this, especially with other people that you come into a trustworthy relationship with, the more you'll be able to just go into dialectic, into dialogos, and then eventually you won't even need the dialectic. You'll be able to just find, feel, trace, track your way to that place where you are most receptive to the spark catching. Now, a final overall caveat. Please understand, Martin, that for all of us, this is still very much a work in progress, and you'll see more, like I say, in episode 24. Chris and I are writing a book, Dialectic into Dialogos, but it's slated to come out So Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Part A comes out this year, and then Part 2 will probably be the following year. And then probably after Socrates will be turned into a book next, and then Dialectic and Dialogos. So we have a set of 4 books planned, and I'm hoping by the time we get to the book, we've got a little bit better articulation of the theory and engineering of the practice. I hope this helps, Martin. It was a little bit wandering, but I was trying very hard to give you sort of the cutting edge of what's happening for me. So thank you very much for your question. The next is from Jalad or Galad. Thank you very much for your support. Hi, John. Thanks again for all your work. Thank you for thanking me. Again, always appreciated. I've been watching After Socrates, slowly, not yet caught up, and I'm finding it very interesting and useful. Thank you for saying that. Like, we release every week, but go through After Socrates at your pace. Especially if you're discussing it with other people, taking up the practices. That's totally how you should be doing it. I'll now continue with what Galad has to say. I've been rewatching Awakening from the Meaning Crisis as well, and want to ask about an insight I had regarding Socrates' rejection of truth without relevance. Oh, cool. What occurred to me is, that truth that isn't made relevant enough to others cannot be tested as thoroughly and is less likely to be true. Oh, that's very good. That's very good. You're making this is not to take any credit away from you. I have made connections, not there, but when I teach about this at U of T in my course on the psychology of wisdom, I do make connections about evidence for truth and relevance, and how evidence ultimately depends on relevance. This is based on a paper that my good friend and I, Dan Chiappi, published in 1997 about just that relationship, amongst other things. So I think that's an excellent insight. In other words, if people have solid claims which no one wants to listen to, I could easily be self-deceptive, falling prey to my biases. If I really want to know the truth, my presentation has to compel others to engage with my claims. I have to engage in real dialogue. I think this is right. I think this is deeply right. And this is part of the argument, the whole argument of After Socrates. Again, not to take any credit away from you. Your insight is pertinent and astute. But I happen to think that ultimately rationality, and I make this argument, and I made it also in my talk at Ralston and other places. I think rationality is ultimately dialogical in exactly the way you're talking about. And I think this is the great difference between Plato's dialogues and Aristotelian treatises. Now, in fairness to Aristotle, that's probably not due to him. He wrote a lot of dialogues, but they were lost. And what we have are basically lecture notes. But that shift, nevertheless, was very impactful. Is this convergent with your view on the matter, or do you think I'm missing something? I think you could tell from my response that I think you're bang on. I think it's very convergent. And we need to do more work about knowledge and evidence and understanding and relevance. So here's knowledge and evidence, and here's understanding and relevance, and then there's some interpenetrating relationship between evidence and relevance, just like there is between knowledge and understanding. And that needs to be better worked out. And so if I had Doctor Who's TARDIS, and I could go in there for 10, 15 years and come out in no time have passed, I would definitely like to do this. I have a wonderful problem. Because of all of these, like what's happening right now, all the people I get to interact with and all the insights, there's so many things, arguments I want to pursue, theoretical bridges I want to build, synoptic integration I want to afford, that it's amazing, like when in you're a maze. So I want to thank you for this. I think this is really, really good. Again, this is Gilad. Thank you for all your work and for these Q&A specifically. You're very, very welcome, and thank you for your support. I now want to move to a question from Chance, or it might be Chance, I don't know. I've heard different pronunciations for this writing, so if I get your name, the pronunciation wrong, please forgive me. It reminds me of Being There, the Peter Sellers movie. Um, Excellent movie, by the way. Excellent movie. I recommend it. The book is really well written too. Unfortunately, the author was overtaken by the very problem of the meaning crisis that he was confronting, and um, uh, committed suicide. There were some things happening with his health, I believe, too. So just if you get a chance, read the book or see the movie. Now back to Chance's question. I find that I tend to not believe as deeply as I experienced believing as a child. Yes. So this is a perennial theme in literature. You'll even find this in literature from the Bronze Age. You'll also find the reverse of it. St. Paul's great hymn to agape. When I was a child, I thought and spoke as a child, but when I became a man, I put those childish ways behind me, as a way of trying to explain the change that occurs when you get the sophrosun that comes from agape. So this is a perennial theme. What would be a good way to distinguish jadedness and or incredulity from epistemic humility when it comes to non-propositional belief? Is the level of postulate sufficient, or does the movement towards conviction need to be pursued? I would lean a little bit more on the last question, but I'll try and answer the first question. And maybe that will help give me some further insight into the second question. So part of it is you have to develop a very powerful internal perspectival knowing. And I think Siegel is right. Mindfulness within is just internalization of mind-sightedness without. Kids can pick up on other people's mental states way before they can introspect their own. And then we internalize that, and we do that in an imaginal fashion. There is no little space. There is literally no space in your head. That is an imaginal space through and through. It's just so familiar to us all that we forget that. In that imaginal space, what's the taste in your mind of your disbelief? What's the tempo? What's the texture? Does it feel mean-spirited? Does it feel reactive and fast? Does it feel very sort of brittle? Does it feel very resistant? Do you have when you try and pick up on the emotional tone, is it very diffident, defensive? Is there a sense of not learning and being resistant to being deceived? And this is very hard to keep. And so you have to develop like a connoisseur discernment of this. And I'm not claiming to be a sage. I'm claiming that with the decades of practice and all the learning and reading I've done, I have glimpses of this. And then I see it reflected in people like Socrates and the Buddha when they're interacting with their interlocutors, right? But you can develop that connoisseur discernment. Like you connoisseur, you have the very, the very refined ability to taste these differences within your internal state. And for me, that is the way I distinguish from a kind of jadedness, hard-heartedness, mean-spirited, defensive nihilism, right? I can't figure it out, so I'm not going to let anybody else figure it out. I got a negative answer, so I'm going to make sure that everybody else comes to a negative answer. So you can really pick up on the tenor and try to use that as like a summation of all the other T's: the taste, the tempo, the texture, the timing, right? Try to pick up on all of those. Whereas when you have epistemic humility, there's a genuine feeling of wonder. There's a sense of I'm learning now. There's a sense of I'm being corrected, but that's helping more than hurting. There's a sense of gratitude and novelty for what the other might have provided to you. So the other the way it comes down, I would say, is when you're jaded, you're trying to like harden your heart against self-deception, whereas in epistemic humility you're trying to open your heart in response to epistemic humility and the possibility of self-deception. um, and you find that the second will get you into more of a flowing and potentially even a flow state with the world, whereas the first prevents that flow from ever happening. I hope this was helpful. And yeah, I think it went towards your second point about conviction, but I'm really trying to really open up the phenomenology of the sense of conviction and really get you to become a connoisseur of its complexity so that your discernment becomes like multiply constrained and therefore much more likely to open you to the truth. So thank you. We'll now move on to Bumbu. Thank you very much for your support. Hi, John. In the deepening Vipassana meditation lesson, you mentioned that the goal is to meditate on the silence between the thoughts by applying the 5 factors of inquiring mindfulness. Yes, the vigilance, sensitivity, acuity, noticing, and reminding. Yes. Does it mean that one should apply each factor in sequence? I can see how to apply sensitivity and acuity, but noticing is strange because my emotional and mental state seem to blank. Yes, you should apply them in sequence. So your emotional and mental state in response to the distraction seems to blank. Can you try to treat that blankness as a portal? Instead of it being a wall, there's like, because what's happening is a kind of resistance. Can you soften it? Can you soften to what's there and let stuff bubble up through that so you get some insight into your emotional and mental framing of the distraction? So you enter into a more like dialogical relationship to the blankness, because blankness usually means that we're getting a kind of indirect resistance there, where we're pulling away from the distraction, but we're pulling away into the possibility of not really learning about our emotional and mental framing. Now, that might be happening, and that would be my advice. If what you mean by blank is the distraction just disappears, and that's why you can't get a grip on your mental or emotional framing, that goes back to the overall principle. Just then return right to your breath and start your deepening Vipassana practice. So remember, always return to your breath, then go back into the deepening practice. Also, when I get to reminding, do I start from the beginning, vigilance, and go in loops, or do I let it go and just observe the silence? Thank you. When you get to the reminding, right, you only do the reminding if, right, you find that you're getting, like, if you find that you're getting distracted a lot, right? Sorry, that's exactly wrong. What I mean, if you're getting explanatory and reactive to your distraction, that's what I meant to say. I apologize for that error. So if you're staying in the practice of meditating on your distractions as opposed to interacting in an argumentative, explanatory fashion with the content, then you don't need to do the reminding. But if you find that you're doing a lot of explaining, justifying, theorizing, that's when you do the reminding. And then, like I said, first of all, go back to following the breath, then go right into deepening the Vipassana. And you only do the 4, right? If you can maintain, so you're distracted, you step back, you label it, and then you do the vigilance, the sensitivity, the acuity, and the noticing. And you only do the reminding if you find that you've lost that and you're doing explaining, in which you just let it all go, come back to the breath, and then return to the deepening practice. Okay. So I hope that helps, Boom. And I thank you for your support and for your excellent question. Now, question from Alexandra Zachary. Great to hear from you, Alexandra, all the work. I believe I owe you a couple emails. I will try to get to them. Things are very hectic, but I really appreciate the work you're doing. Hi, John. Hope you're well. I am now. I was really sick for about 12 days. Not last week, the week before. Worse than COVID. It wasn't COVID, got tested, but worse than COVID. But much better now. I remember reading Julian Jaynes a year ago, and I just wondered if you could comment his idea in the bicameral mind, especially about the whole thing that the gods stopped answering us externally and were internalized. Seems like dialogical thinking ideas have evolved somewhat from Jaynes's work. Lots of love. Thank you. Yeah, Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I have a book that's sort of 20 years after. It's more than 20 years, sorry. I think it's 2020. That's where I'm getting the 20 from. It came out about an anthology of sort of how people have been following up on this, and the fact that we have a large percentage of the population. I've heard the estimate, and it doesn't seem implausible, at 30% of the population of people who hear voices, and they're not schizophrenic, they're not mentally disordered in any way, and they're high-functioning individuals. There are some practices. There are some times when you're deep in IFS or ally work, or deep within meditation, in which you can hear voices. And so the idea of a stark change that Jaynes proposed is questionable. It seems much more malleable. For those of you who aren't aware, Jaynes proposed, and Jaynes, I remember when I was at the ROM, that's the Royal Ontario Museum, and I was working with an Egyptologist there, and she came to a section where she was talking about these skulls that were being preserved, and it looks like people were sort of talking to the skulls. And I brought up Jaynes's book, and she smiled, and she was a wonderful person, great to work with her. And I think I really agree with her assessment. She said, that's a book with hundreds of wonderful ideas and thousands of bad ideas. Jaynes's idea was that before something like the Bronze Age collapse, people did not have, he makes a mistake. Here's one of the mistakes. He confuses consciousness which even cats have, with self-consciousness, that reflective self-awareness. He thinks the two hemispheres weren't as integrated as much, and the right hemisphere spoke to the left hemisphere, and these speakings were interpreted as the voice of the gods or the ancestors. And again, and the idea was we're mistranslating a lot of the ancient texts. I doubt that the people of the pre-Bronze Age world were in that state. We have met, of course, populations, and I'm not saying that hunter-gatherer populations are ahistorical and don't evolve, but they were clearly outside the historical causal timeline of the Bronze Age collapse. And we meet hunter-gatherer societies, and they do not seem to have this kind of bicameral mind. They seem to be reflectively self-aware. They have mature metacognition. So I find Jaynes's proposal too strong. I think it's implausible. The idea that human beings can get into these states, I think that's very plausible, and I think it's much more pervasive than Jaynes realized. And towards your final point, Alexandra, the idea is that the Socratic shift, we're opening up, because Socrates had his daemonium. So where does Socrates fit in Jaynes's proposal? He's clearly a pivotal and paradigmatic figure of the axial age revolution in full swing, and yet he's hearing voices that are guiding him. Yet he's deeply capable of like he's one of the most self-aware individuals of all time and metacognitive. He just counterexamples James's proposal to death, right? And I think what we're better coming to realize is how inherently, and I argued for this in the series, and I come back to it a couple of times, how inherently dialogical we are through and through. And so I totally agree with you. So, Alexander, I hope that was a good answer to your question. Now, a question from Varun, and I'm very happy to get this question. Varun's last question I thought was deeply astute about, that we need to make the curating, I think that's the best way, the curating of the constraints on our social media, the algorithms and other things, a proper domain in our wisdom cultivation, the way we can cultivate salience habits and rationality habits. I think this was just brilliant, and I'm going to keep mentioning that. So what does Varun have to say now? I can imagine a number of ways in that an agent might formally test whether another agent possesses specific propositional or procedural knowledge. But I'm struggling to come up with ideas for formally testing participatory and perspectival knowledge, or test for whether an agent even possesses its capacity to capture such knowledge. Do you have any thoughts? Yes, we already have existing tests. Some of them are low level, but we could build on them. So one of the tests we reliably use for perspectival knowing, and we use it for little kids, is the false belief test. And it tests the existence of perspectival knowing and perspective taking in this way. So you bring a small child and you show them, right? You show them two puppets, right? And the first puppet watches you, both puppets watch you place the candy in box A, right? And then the first puppet is taken outside of the room and the door is closed. And the second puppet is there, and you move the candy from box A to box B, and you close it. Then you bring the first puppet back, and then you ask the child, where will that first puppet say the candy is, right? And little kids will say B, because they know that the candy is in B. That's their perspective, and they can't differentiate their perspective from the perspective of the puppet. But after a certain stage, when they start to pick up on theory of mind, I would say it's not a theory. I would say it's perspective taking, which is exactly what it is. And that's a whole other can of worms I won't get into right now. The fact that we've misunderstood a perspectival capacity as the generation of a propositional theory. Oh boy, but let's just put that aside. Siegel's idea that we're talking about mind sight, not theory of mind, I think is really important. See, we think the only perspectives are theoretical in nature. Anyways, back to the thing. As the child gets the capacity to take the perspective, think of the imaginal capacity there, to take the perspective of the first puppet, the puppet will say box, the first box, because that puppet did not see the candy being moved from the first box to the second box. So we have tests like that, right? And they basically indicate a capacity for perspective taking. Now you may say, well, that only works for little kids. Here's a version of it that you can do with adults. So what you can do is you can write a letter, right, on and then ask people to turn it around and show it to somebody else. Sometimes a more complex drawing, and then you can ask people, describe how the person you're talking to is seeing that. And what the research show is that as people go higher up dominance hierarchies, like within corporations, they get increasingly disabled at being able to say how the other person is seeing the situation. So they start to revert back to the rigid egocentrism, in that sense that I described of small children. So there are definitely perspectival tests. So participatory tests we do have them, but our society is in flux about them right now. because basically what we've had tests for significant identity change. Participatory knowing is knowing by identifying with and by being transformed in your identification with yourself, so that you have also incorporated how you're identifying with the other. This right? You're both participating in a shared co-identification, co-development. So we have usually tested for that by seeking tests for whether or not somebody has gone through an identity change. And there's no way to talk about this without pissing somebody off, but this is the proper thing we have to talk about. We have to stop pretending that we have the ontology and the epistemology of identity all worked out. Like, it's just preposterous, right? And we used to think that, and contrary to what the right says, right, we have always afforded people significant identity change. We let people go from being a child to an adult, from being single to being married, from being secular to being a monk, from unenlightened to enlightened. Like we have allowed. St. Paul talks about, I used to be this way, and now I'm this way, and in Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, male or female. Like, we have allowed for significant identity change. That's fundamentally what we think education should do. But what we've done is we have, until recently, thought identity is really complex and really inherently valuable thing. And therefore, we need very stringent tests on if people have changed their identity and come into new kinds of participatory knowing. And I think you see that pattern cross-cultural. The idea that changing, because participatory knowing is so primordial, changing it is so significant, so profound in the sense of deep, profundus, right? That we have said the tests for identity change need to be very, very significant. We need to see new traits of character. We need to see reconfiguration of the kinds of relationships that people have, the company they keep, the practices, the ecology of practices they have committed themselves to. This is why, once again, to praise her, I think Rachel Hayden's model of gender transition being wrapped into an aspirational model that carries with it all of these characterological demands is the correct model, because it doesn't deny the possibility of the transition or the transformation, the change of identity, but it properly understands the degree to which we don't understand identity and the need to which and how valuable it is, and therefore tests of identity should be powerful tests. So I would recommend that you take a look at the kind of tests that are exigent in the wisdom traditions for whether or not somebody has genuinely made a change of identity. So, Varun, I hope that was helpful to you. I hope people heard me clearly. How I answered that very tricky question. And I hope we can create this space. And I will recommend again Rachel Hayden's important and exemplary work on this. Nicola Simonoff or Simonoff, which one, I don't know. First of all, I want to express my deepest gratitude for your work and the changes it brought about me and many more around me. Thank you, Nicola. Every time you define a wisdom practice and as one that transfers outside the practice itself, I keep thinking that with the right stance, even the most mundane. Mundane. You spelled it differently than the normal spelling, so I mispronounced. I apologize. Can become a wisdom practice, and on the other hand, one can participate in the most profound practice and has no transfer of any wisdom into his life. There's something about care that could come from a person, from the structure of the practice, or from the comfort of the repetitiveness of the ritual that lowers defenses and opens up a person to the possibility of change. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this. I think this is exactly right. I think we have to understand, and rituals always have understood this. We've understood that the ritual can do the kind of conducing that you're talking about, the repetition, right, lowering the defensive, the lowering of defensive, the inherent structuring of it, but that is insufficient. Right? Even the most mundane task could be turned into a wisdom practice that transfers. And of course, you get stories of this, particularly from the Zen tradition, in which somebody's just sweeping, right, the courtyard of the monastery, and they hear a stone click on the sidewalk, and they achieve enlightenment because of that. So I think that's totally right, because this is ultimately transjective. Rituals are ultimately transjective. They are co-created both by the ritual itself, the structure of the objective structure of the ritual and its interaction, but also by the attitude, the basic existential stance that someone is bringing to it. So I think the answer is exactly what you said. So thank you very much, Nicola. All right, we are now shifting to live questions from the chat. And thank you for our Patreon subscribers of everyone watching right now. David Swedlow. David, great pleasure to hear from you again. I hope you're well. Leaving drama aside, challenging as that may be, David Snowden's criticism of Neoplatonism may have some validity, but I think it's too narrow and he goes too far comparing it to Manichaeism. Totally. Totally. I mean, Plotinus has an entire Aeneid against the Gnostics, entitled Against the Gnostics, in which he makes it clear how different, importantly different, Neoplatonism, and that's just at the origin of Neoplatonism, is from Manichaeism. Yeah. Now, the validity, I would say, that's in Snowden's critique is that there are versions of Neoplatonism which overemphasize the emanation at the expense of the emergence. I think this is, even though he is like very clearly and explicitly against the Gnostics, there is this tendency in Plotinus. But you can immediately see Proclus and Iamblichus trying to respond to this and get right, try to balance out the bottom up. And then, of course, when you get to the Christian Neoplatonists, especially Erigena, this complete interpenetration of emergence and emanation within a notion of creation, not as the making of an artifact, but of that complete interpenetration of emergence and emanation, I think clearly distinguishes Neoplatonism from Manichaeism. And the best evidence for that, as a simple fact, is the fact that Neoplatonism, at multiple times in history, has been a powerful instigator for science, whereas Manichaeism would not in any way motivate you into the scientific investigation of the natural world. It would consider that sinful, egregious, binding yourself to the prison, etc. So I'll continue with what David says. I think your sense of the oneness of Neoplatonism is not as elitist as he claims. Curious if you have looked at the new materialism he prefers. Is there any ground worth covering in the distinction? So the version of the new materialism I've looked at is the object-oriented ontology, and you have to know that like people like Morton and Harman are very concerned about neither overmining or undermining an object. So take any object, you undermine it if you try and reduce it just to its components. You overmine it if you try to just reduce it to how it fits into a network. They don't say this. I would say you've got emanation and emergence, and what you really want is an optimal grip that affords you, like, cultivating the virtue of not going to either one of these vices. It's kind of a golden mean, and I think that is very much what I mean by the one-oneing. I know that's what I mean because I can comment on what my intent is and how I'm trying to convey it. And I think the new materialism of things. New materialism overlaps. It's not completely identical with object-oriented ontology, but they overlap significantly. I think the sense of material in there, like, I don't even know what that's referring to. It's certainly not Cartesian matter. It's certainly not Aristotelian matter. It's certainly not what modern physicists mean by matter. It feels like sort of some weird Newtonian. And when I read the text, it's definitely not like it's definitely not materialism in any other sense than that we're talking about causation and not just logical relations between propositions or something like that. Look, physics is seriously considering, and I mean seriously, that space and time are not fundamental. And if space and time are not fundamental, I don't know what material object means or the claim that it is fundamental. So I think that's what I have to say about the new materialism. And then David clarifies, suspect critics of Neoplatonism may prefer emergence and deny emanation. Yes. And looking at the middle way of the membrane between the two is what I find the most fertile area. Exactly, David. Exactly. Thank you very much for your excellent question. Next is from Neil Baird. Thank you, Neil, for your support. What are your thoughts on self-determination theory? Yes. Yes. Ryan and Dicey, I've been working on integrating your work into strength training, and STD seems like a good bridge between exercise motivation and your work. Yes, we in the paper that Leo Ferraro and I wrote, it's a book chapter in Scientific Perspectives on Personal Wisdom on the cognitive scientific account of wisdom. We make a lot of work, make a lot of use, thankful, appreciative use of self-determination theory and ideas of autonomy and competence and connectedness. Right, and I think, and this is happening, a deeper integration of the meaning in life literature, the self-determination theory literature, and the well-being literature. I'm thinking particularly of Michael Bishop's work. What's his book called? Well-being. Very good, very recent. Is what is needed right now, and I do contribute to that in certain ways. And so I think highly of that theory. I think it needs to be integrated with other theories in the way I've indicated. And I think you integrating it into your training is a helpful thing. I would give one caution. Autonomy is the virtue par excellence for Kant. And it's what leads to the fragmentation of the true, the good, and the beautiful. I think you have to be, autonomy matters. I'm not saying, but I think right now, because of our historical period, we're in sort of this post-Kantian rain shadow, I would emphasize connectedness. Right? So give more emphasis to connectedness. Definitely track autonomy and competence, but give more, because this is what the meaning in life literature is showing. Give more emphasis to the connectedness part. I hope that helps, Neil. So, thank you for your support, Nathan Hubler. Thank you, Nathan. How do you think your work can be applied for people who are not as intellectually focused? I've noticed this is a common gap between academic and layman. I'm not sure the best way to bridge this gap. Yeah. And I keep getting, I got feedback today from somebody who's not opinion because she makes good arguments, whose conclusions and observations matter about, how I did recently, like on the Tim Ferriss show, and about, first of all, paying proper attention to the medium. And allowing people to set up context more. I've been told I've been getting better, but I want you to know that I'm continually working on this, on bridging between inappropriate dumbing down and inappropriate jargon, and trying to find the zone of proximal development for the greatest number of people, kind of a utilitarian zone of proximal development, where it's challenging, because if it's not challenging, you actually won't learn. It has to be something you have to stretch yourself a little, and you have to be using what's actually going on at the time in order to understand it. So for when people just say, "Oh, it's word salad," which means I just can't, and what they mean by that, there's time when that's a legitimate criticism, but there's times when they mean I can't just easily assimilate that to what I already know. I don't care about that, because it shouldn't be easily assimilated. It should require some accommodation on your part. But trying to find that optimal grip between inappropriate jargon and right and sort of talking only to other academics, using that discourse and dumbing it down inappropriately and losing the argument and the challenge to and the inspiration to aspiration to transform. I'm working really hard on that. I'm getting lots of feedback. Like I said, I get some today. I'm really trying to do my best to that. I try and do that by entering into dialogue with other people, so it's not just my monologue growing sort of monolithically, like self-contained. All I can say is I don't have an answer. Maybe there isn't one, like a method. I aspire to getting better at this. I'm trying to listen and learn and transform as much as I can. And I'm also relying on other people to help me build that bridge. I can't do it on my own. So thank you, Nathan. I hope that was a responsible answer. The next question is from, I think it's Delta Introvert. Very interesting handle. Introverts unite quietly in your rooms by yourself. I'm an introvert too, so I understand that. Lately, I learned that Heraclitus, or Heraclitus, depending on how you want to pronounce it, was one of Nietzsche's favorite philosophers. Of course, Nietzsche believes in the flux, and Heraclitus was the great philosopher of the flux. This is why Nietzsche doesn't like Plato, one of the many reasons, although the worst reading you can get about Plato, I think, comes from Nietzsche, because Plato regards the flux as very problematic in I think justifiable ways that Nietzsche does not ever explicitly respond to. He just insults Plato. It's one of the low marks within Nietzsche's work. One of three main pre-Socratic figures. His ideas resonate with me very well. I wonder, John, do you also have some sentiment about him, and do you think we can add something from him to our project of defeating the meta crisis? Yes, I think the inheritors of Heraclitus are the process philosophers and theologians, like Whitehead, like my friend Matt Segal, right? The process theology is the proper response. And Whitehead is somebody I will continue to return to again and again and again in my development. I can see this. I know this. I'm confident about that. And so the process philosophers need, and I try to get them into, Whitehead will be in the next series. I promise you that. And so the process philosophers, which also overlap with a lot of Buddhist thought, really, I've been trying to get them more and more into this cultural conversation we're having in this little corner of the internet. The thing about Nietzsche is Nietzsche only pays attention to the flux in Heraclitus, that everything is changing and there's opposition, what I would now call opponent processing. The idea of opponent processing originates in Heraclitus, the tonos. Nietzsche doesn't quite get that enough, and Nietzsche completely misses Heraclitus on the logos. Here's Heraclitus. Don't listen to my words, but listen to the logos within them. Everything is one. That's also Heraclitus. And that also has to be understood. And Plato saw that in a way Nietzsche didn't. And so the process philosophers, yes, there is flux, but there's also self-organization, opponent processing, complexification. So that is how I think we need to bring the whole, and how we can bring the whole Heraclitean tradition more into this cultural conversation. I am doing it. And I hope to be talking with Matt soon. And I recommend him strongly and his two books if you want to get into this. So everyone, thank you so much for joining me for this Q&A. We're doing these every third Sunday of the month, usually at 3 p.m. Eastern time, but please pay attention to the messages. Please. Oh, I just got a message from Madeline. I'll be talking to Matt in April, so you can look forward to that. We'll be doing these at 3 p.m. ET, but please pay attention to messages from Madeline because both my schedule and her schedule are very packed, a lot of stuff happening, and there's sometimes contingencies we can't presage and control for. So I really appreciate everybody's flexibility. And one more time, thank you all for all of your support, financial and emotional. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you for your time and attention, and take good care, everyone.